thank you so much for coming on a Saturday. Well, this is, I really appreciate your presence. I'm very excited to see several familiar faces, and also I look forward to getting to know the new. So today I will share with you the application of Markov chain analysis to the supervisory interactions. And I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. Okay. First, I have to say that thank you so much, Dr. N, for inviting me to your research in counseling lab at Oregon State, through which I will be able to share some research that I have been doing. And I also would like to say thank you, Gideon and Gretchen, for very thoughtfully coordinating this webinar. I really appreciate that. Okay, let's get started. Before we start talking about the very detailed specifics about Markov chain analysis, I think I would give you a very brief introduction about the context of my research that will help you understand how I come to become interested in Markov chain analysis and where I am right now. So my overall research agenda, as you can see from this slide, is about counselor training. And I have primarily two research lines. The first is about the relational dynamics of clinical supervision. And the second is the professional development of international counseling students and faculty. I'm also work very closely with Dr. Liu, who is also here today, on adoption-related studies. So the reason why I am interested in doing supervision research is very related to my personal supervision experience in the past as a master's student and also as a doc student. I personally benefited tremendously from supervision, and that inspired me to think about what actually happened in supervision that were so helpful. So I began to dig into the literature, trying to find the answers to my question. And I found a lot of great evidence-based research that helped me understand what are some characteristics of supervisor, characteristics of supervisee, the relationship between supervisor and the supervisee, the factors that may be impacting their working alliance. All of them are great research. But one thing that I noticed is that is less attended to is what actually happened in supervision. So a lot of the studies, they focus on either supervisors or supervisees' retrospective reflection on or their perception about supervision. But what actually happened between supervisor and the supervisee, what they say, how the dynamics evolve in supervision is relatively less unknown. So I began to use sequential analysis, which is a one-step prediction of the presence of one type of behavior is going to increase or decrease the likely presence of another type of behavior. So in the past, I did one study by using sequential analysis where I found either supervisors or supervisees opinion-related verbal behavior is likely to trigger the others' positive social and emotional verbal exchange back. So that can have some implication for practitioners if they are supervising supervisee, if they would like to elicit more positive social emotional behavior, they may consider using more opinions, and or they may, and this is very reciprocal. If they want to elicit more opinions in supervisees, they may consider using more positive social and emotional behavior. But that was a one-step prediction, which was very helpful for me to understand the dynamics of supervision at a very micro level. But then I began to think about whether we can go beyond the one-step prediction to see whether there is any underlying pattern that is behind the scene, behind the very minor micro level exchanges between supervisor and supervisee. So then I continue to search and see whether any analysis may be helpful. And one day I ran across an article written by Dr. Dice and Hedrick. So Dr. Dice was my doctoral advisor when I was a doc student at University of Iowa. I began to read his article. I found he used Markov chain analysis to study and also detected the generalizable differences of the counseling skills development between more effective counselors in training and less effective counselors in training. So I was very amazed by how the qualitative data can be quantified and studied, and the underlying patterns may be detected or predicted. So that's how I can become more interested in Markov chain analysis. So here, I would like to know whether any of you know something about Markov chain analysis, and is there anything that you would like to particularly know, which may be helpful for you to answer your research question or any research idea so far? Okay, maybe, oh, looks like Dr. Liu has a question or some comment.
No, I just have a thought. I guess one of the purpose that I attended this webinar is I collected some data from group counseling course that we did a experiential growth group. I think probably a lot of the programs do that. So along the 15 weeks of this semester, we collected students' journals.
Mm-hmm.
So like weekly, they would reflect on critical incidents, like the prompts that we provided. So it's, I guess I'm curious to learn how that, or whether or not that would have potential to be, I guess, quantified and then sort of like analyze the students' trajectory of growth.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. And after I share how I perform data analysis, you may be able to find the answer to your question. Thank you. Any other attendee who have anything to share before I get started about Markov chain analysis? Okay, let me move on. So my agenda today, first I will introduce what the Markov chain analysis is, why is it applicable to studying supervisory interactions, and this may be the part where Dr. Liu is going to be very interested in to know. And I will share with you how to perform the Markov chain analysis, and then I would love to invite each and every one of you to be actively participating and share what your thoughts are, your comments, and whether you think this analysis may be helpful for you to either ask research questions or answer some research questions that you may already have in your mind. Markov chain analysis is a stochastic model. When we say stochastic, it means that we're studying a collection of random variables from the perspective of their interdependence and limiting behavior. So this actually makes supervision interaction a very good candidate to study, because in supervision, when we are having verbal exchanges either as supervisor or supervisee, it's not totally predictable what each person is going to say. So we say this is a group of random variables in supervision interaction. At the same time, even though it's not everything is predictable, if a supervisee asks a supervisor a question about some logistics issues, it's very likely the supervisor is going to answer the question in terms of logistics, instead of jumping into some intervention or case conceptualization. So this is the place where we say the behaviors in supervision, in the interaction, the random variable actually are also interdependent on one another. It's limiting one another. So I think this makes supervisory interaction very good to be studied from the stochastic model and by applying a Markov chain analysis. But before we performing Markov chain analysis, there are two assumptions that we have to follow. The first assumption is the transition probabilities are stationary. Here, the transition means the movement between the states. And the states here are actually the events of interest. For my study, I define my state of event of interest as the very common supervision tasks, common supervision events that may be experienced by many supervisor or supervisee in their dyads. So the transition probability are stationary means that what we observed, the transition probability, their movement from one state to another, what we observed, the probability are relatively consistent based on what we observed, based on what we calculated of those transition probabilities. We assume that it's going to stay consistent. So over time, we can use what we observed to predict as a result of the sequence of transition, whether there is any eventual pattern that can be seen. Also, the probability of moving between any two states is not subject to their place in the series of transitions, which means that this may be the moment as a supervisor, I'm working with my supervisee on case conceptualization. At the next moment, I will feel free to jump into maybe intervention state, or I may be jumping into the foundational competency to discuss specific counseling skills with my supervisee. So the probability of moving between them will not be limited. The second underlying assumption is that each subsequent state is primarily dependent on the antecedent state as the process unfolds. So usually, like what I just shared with you earlier, whenever the supervisee asks logistics related question, usually the supervisor is going to answer that question from the same lens, even though the supervisor may mention something else or avoid answering the question directly, but still it's interdependent on one another. So here I wonder whether you have any questions before I move on. Okay. Remember the definitions here, assumptions here, which may be helpful for you to define and also decide whether your research questions may be answered by doing Markov chain analysis.
Dr. Lee?
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to, this is, by point of clarification, this is all brand new to me, and so I don't want to slow you down, and I don't want to slow the group down, but it's also very interesting. And for instance, those two assumptions, I probably, with a little more time, could understand them, but they're not really clear to me, but I don't really want to interrupt you to ask you to explain it again. So I guess I'm wondering what your feeling is about time constraints and how much interaction you want, or whether you'd rather save that time for the end. Does that make, is that clear?
Yeah, so I think I plan to present for about 1 hour, and we're going to have about half hour to discuss any questions or thoughts that people may have here. But I would like to, I wonder whether if there are any points specifically that you feel less clear to you. I can answer your question, because it's great that John, you bring this up. Your question may also be other attendees' question as well.
Yeah, and that's really whether other people may be more familiar with it. And so they, for instance, I think the professor who asked the question, this would probably all be very easy for her to assimilate in her prior knowledge. And that may be true of other people here too. So if you feel like you need the hour to continue presenting the information, I really don't want to slow that down. And I'm satisfied to take the risk and wait till the end. And maybe you'll provide the slides and I can also look at it additionally further, and you provided your email address. So that's another possibility maybe.
Okay, thank you so much, John. What about this? I will move on with the presentation, and maybe later when I perform the analysis itself, it will help explain part of part of the information regarding the assumptions. And still after the webinar, if you would like to know more about this analysis, we may have communication either through email or schedule another Zoom meeting. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And somebody else offered a suggestion to put questions in the chat box. So that makes sense too. So thank you very much for taking my question, and take the floor.
Thank you so much, John.
Yes.
I will be more mindful as I move through other slides. Whenever there is any information regarding the assumptions, I'm going to bring it up. So Markov chain analysis not only describe the likely immediate response of the supervisor or supervisee, but also predicts the eventual pattern as a result of the interaction sequence. So here, I know it sounds a little bit abstract, maybe literally it makes sense, but I would like to use an example to illustrate. This may also help answer the question that John brings up, how to contextualize the abstract language. Okay, here is one example. Let's assume in a local high school, well, it's very common. Sometimes the students may experience some psychological distress. So maybe in this school, 20% of the students may go to see a school counselor, and 80% of the students, whenever they experience some distresses, they will find a friend to talk to them. So this is the first session, let's imagine. So after one session, the students who talk to the school counselor, they feel great, they were heard, and school counselor were very helpful. 90% of them will come back to see the same school counselor again, whereas 10% of them feel, it looks like the school counselor break my confidentiality. I'm not going to trust my school counselor again. So they may turn to talk to their friends. And for the students who originally talked to their friends in the first session, they feel 30% of them feel, I think my friends really helped me. They're great listeners. I'm going to continue to talk to them. But 70% of them may feel, I really would like to talk to a professional instead of some friend's advice. So 70% of them will go to see the school counselor. So this is the second session. Here, from the chart on the right, this is an immediate response. But if the same pattern holds for the third session, it's still about 90% of them are going to stay for the school counselor, 10% are moving on to the friends. So if the pattern holds, what's going to happen after 10 sessions? What's going to happen after one semester? What's going to happen after one academic year? So here is an example where we say the probability holds. Let me go back a little bit. The transition probabilities are stationary. I hope these help explain a little bit about the probability are stationary. We assume the same pattern holds or relatively unchanged. And then the probabilities of moving between any two states is not subject to the place in the series of the transitions. And also for the second underlying assumption, each subsequent state is primarily dependent on the antecedent state. It's because after talking to the school counselor, if they feel positive after talking to them, they're coming back for another session. If they feel the school counselor don't help them that much, they may change to talk to their friends. So this is how the subsequent dependent on the antecedent. So I hope that may help a little bit, John. Okay. Markov chain analysis actually is very widely used for professions outside counseling. For instance, in business, you probably all experience that. You do some online shopping, particularly during these days, you probably are shopping more online, and you click based on what you clicked, based on the sequence of what you shopped. It can be predicted by using Markov chain analysis. What is the likelihood for you to like certain type of products? What is your consuming preferences? So it's very widely used in business, very widely used in biology. But in counseling profession, recently there emerging people who are interested in applying this analysis to study counseling-related phenomenon. So for instance, as I mentioned earlier, in 2004, Dice and Hedrick detected the generalizable differences of using basic counseling skills between more effective and less effective counselors in training. In 2014, a group of researchers, they modeled the long-run probabilities of actors and partners' behaviors, the couple's behaviors over time. 2015, more researchers, they investigated the pattern of emotional mimicry in business interactions. So these are a part of some research that I found very interesting that have a big influence on my own research. Okay, now we know today we're going to talk about Markov chain analysis. We know the method we're going to use to explore supervision process features, but what are we now analyzing? We have the tool in our hand. So what is something that we're going to work on? So I would like to invite you to give me a guess. Where are we going to get the data for analysis? And how the data is going to look like? Are we using some inventory to collect some data? Are we using some other means to collect the data? Can you make a guess? It's like a bonus question. Can you think with me and see and imagine what type of data that you think may be needed to perform a Markov chain analysis?
Do you want us to speak or type?
Please unmute yourself and speak, because it's very hard for me to manage both the screen and also the chat box.
I'll take an initial guess that you're going to, I don't know, you're videotaping interactions between supervisors and supervisees, and you're tracking those interactions.
That sounds great. That's great. I think you get a bonus point. Thank you, John. At first, I thought we're going to have a heated discussion, what type of data we're going to use, and so we're going to do some exploration, but you saved my time. Thank you so much. So I will just share with you what I have here. Yes, John is absolutely right that we need to access the supervisor and supervisee interactions. And some people may think, oh, what about, let me take a field trip to observe what is actually happening between supervisor and supervisee. Yes, you can do so. But once you have more than maybe 5 supervisory dyads, that may become less practical. So if we have access to the recorded sessions between supervisor and supervisee, that's going to be great. And then we can manage to transcribe the recordings to the words so that we can analyze. But before we move on to the Markov chain analysis stage, we still need to process the data a little bit, because what we have now is transcripts, the words. What we need is an operational framework to conceptualize, to analyze the qualitative data so that the qualitative data can be turned into a series of the numbers and the transitions between them for Markov chain analysis. And now I'm going to share with you a sample study that I did, which is recently accepted for publication at JCD. And I'm going to walk through each step that I have done. And here is a big picture of the entire process. First, I collected the data from supervisory dyads. It doesn't mean that Markov chain analysis can only be applied to studying the dyads. If you are a supervisor having supervisee at the same, 2 supervisee at the same time, you are using triadic supervision, I think it's applicable as long as you can define the meaningful states. And the verbal, as I said, the verbal language is going to be turned into a series of numbers and the transitions between the numbers. For instance, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. So the data is already quantified. And then we're going to do Markov chain analysis. And hopefully the results is going to shed light on some practice for clinical supervisors or counsel educators. And in that study, I asked 2 research questions. The first are the overall state transitional dynamics of clinical supervision. And these can be studied just based on the supervision recordings, all the recordings that I collected, and then perform data analysis. And the second question is, how do these dynamics vary within 3 supervisory styles respectively, if any? Here you may see that I'm comparing the dynamics across different groups, which means that I need a grouping variable. And the grouping variable for the second question is a supervisory style inventory. So you may have already heard about supervisory styles, or you have already feel identified with a supervisory style. So according to this inventory, there are 3 supervisory styles: attractive, interpersonally sensitive, and task-oriented. The attractive supervisor, they tend to play a consultant's role. They're very open, warm, friendly, and for the interpersonally sensitive supervisor, they tend to play a counselor's role. It doesn't mean that they're therapeutic to their supervisee, but they tend to be very perceptive, invested, therapeutic, not for the supervisee, but they're very attentive to the relationship related issues. And the task-oriented supervisor, they tend to play a teacher's role. They're very structured, very goal-driven, get things done, ask questions, answer questions, teaching their supervisee. So these are the 3 supervisory style, and I'm going to do some subgroup comparison across the 3 different style, and within each, for those who tend to rate their supervisor high in task-oriented, how the dynamics may be similar to or different than those who rate their supervisor less task-oriented. And in that study, I recruited 34 supervisory dyads. Here, it's worth mentioning that some of the participants participated in my study more than 1 time within the 34 dyads, because there were cases when there is 1 supervisor supervising maybe 3 supervisee, and they form 3 supervisory dyads, but the supervisor is the same person. It's just the supervisee are different individuals. I included those data in my data analysis, and I found for each of the dyad, even though it's with the same supervisor, the dynamics are different, but for future studies, in order to minimize the potential patterned influence of the same individual, I strongly recommend that to recruit the sample as diverse as possible. And for the supervision recordings that I collected, the average length of them usually is 40 minutes long. And as I mentioned, I use the supervisory style inventory as the grouping variable. See, so this one will only be used when I answer my second research question, not my first research question, because my first research question is going to examine the dynamics of the entire sample. I will walk through the demographics very briefly, so that you will have some idea what is the sample that I am dealing with, and to what extent you think it may be representative of the population of the community, of the supervision community. So for the supervisors, about 70% are female, 30% male. Supervisees, about 80% female, about 20% male. Supervisor age range seem very diverse, but supervisees age range, you can tell usually it fall into the range of 20 and 30. Supervisor 53% are white, 32% are Asian, 15% Black or African American. Supervisee, predominantly white supervisees, 94% white supervisee, and 6% Black or African American. Supervisor, most of them, as you can see, about half of them, they are actually doctoral student supervisors, and 32% of them, they are faculty supervisor. Supervisee, they are predominantly master's level students, and there are a few postmasters practitioners, and I remember there's only one doctoral student supervisee. Supervision experience, it looks like they're mainly on the two ends of the spectrum. Most of them have less than or equal to 1 year supervision experience, given most of them are doctoral student supervisor. And on the other end, the supervision experience is longer than 7 years. Supervisees counseling experience is not surprising. Most of them fall into between 1 to 2 years. Supervisor mainly indicate their specialty area in counselor education and supervision, school counseling, clinical mental health counseling, and career counseling. Supervisees specialty area, most of them are in the school counseling training area, some of them clinical mental health counseling. There are also some students who indicated other specialty areas. It's not surprising, most of the supervisors are doctoral students here, and some of them university supervisor, and I remember there's only one on-site supervisor. Did John have one question here? Oh, okay. Now we have talked about the data is collected, we transcribe the data. The next step is to code the data. So this is an events-based framework adapted from Boarding's supervisory goals. If you are interested in knowing the 8 goals, please refer back to 1983 Boarding's article, which is about supervisory working alliance. So in this framework, the states 1 through 6, it's progressively complex in nature. For instance, in state 1, it's mainly about social interfacing. It's not uncommon for a supervision session to start with greeting each other, like what we do today in our webinar. We start our session with greeting each other. And if it's a very first session, people will do self-introduction. Throughout the supervision session, there may be times people have casual conversations which are not relevant to supervision, any supervision topic itself. The second stage is about reflecting on foundational competences, which may involve the discussion of very specific counseling skills or techniques. They may talk about specific concepts or counseling theories, or they may talk about the maintenance of standards of service. The third stage is deepening case conceptualization, where the dyad may be processing their understanding of the clients and the client system. For instance, their assumptions about the problem, potential contributing factors to the problem, and the perpetuating system that maintain the problem. The fourth stage is processing the relational management, where the supervisor and supervisee may talk about a specific counseling intervention as a response to the issues that the client brought into the counseling. They may use the IPR, interpersonal process recall, to process the supervisee's awareness of the process issues, where the supervisee were during the moment when they were doing the counseling. They may also talk about their awareness of themselves and the impact of themselves on the process. The fifth stage is about addressing personal and multicultural barriers, where the dyad may process any issues that maybe get in the way of the supervisee's work with their client. Some issues like counter-transference, self-disclosure, multicultural competence, or multicultural awareness, issues like that may happen. So the last stage is about furthering professional development. Based on my personal experience, there were times some research ideas actually come directly from the supervision I received or the supervision that I provided. There may be cases where the dyads process their lifelong learning, commitment to the profession. They may talk about how to integrate their personal and professional identity. So this is the framework that I used to code my data. here is one coding example. The supervisor said, I noticed that your last intervention did strengthen your rapport with your client. How did that progress make you feel? The supervisee may say, I'm feeling much more ready and competent. The supervisor said, that sounds great. So now if you have the chance to assign a code number to this small segment, which number do you think you're going to put? Take a look at this example, and I'm going back to the code book again, and let me know which one do you think it fits. Two, it looks like Dr. N think it's about foundational competency. Any different opinions or ideas? Four, okay, let's see. I noticed that some people say something in the chat box, but when I click on it, it didn't show up. Okay, so let's see what I code. Yes, I put 4 there. So specifically, it's about increasing the awareness of self and the impact on process. So if you are going to develop any a code book, make sure the subcategories or example that you put into the category can be as specific as possible. Particularly if you are working with a team of the coders, make sure the code book is very operationalized, as specific as possible. So now we have a series of the numbers that we coded the data. So with the series of the number, what I did the next is that I turned those numbers, the series of the numbers and the transitions between them into a frequency matrix here. As you can see from this matrix, the antecedent states are in the rows, and for the column, these are the subsequent states. So here, let's take a look at the cell 3-4. If there is a number 100, this means that the transition based on my observation of my sample, I noticed that the transition from state 3 to state 4, it occurred 100 times. From case conceptualization to relational management, it occurred 100 times. And the next thing that I did is to transform the frequency matrix into a probability matrix or a transition matrix. The probability for each column is going to add up to 1 because for any moment, for any dyad, for the next moment, they probably will stay in the same state, or they're going to transition to one of the other 5 states. Then the next step is to perform the analysis where there is an equation for Markov chain analysis. And if you take a look at the matrix on the right, first what I did was for the probability matrix, I raised the matrix to the 50th power for iteration. The purpose of iterating this matrix is to make sure that the probabilities that I'm getting is going to be stable, so that with the longer time period of the time, the probability is not going to change. And for my study, actually, once I iterate it for about 30 times, it's already stable, but 50 is a very typically used default, the power that people raise. And the next step is I will multiply this iterated matrix with an initial state vector. This initial state vector means that the supervisory dyad, they start from state 1. Usually they start any supervision session with greeting one another. The probability for the first state is going to be 100%, leaving all other states 0. After applying the multiplication rule of the matrix and the initial state vector, I'm going to get a steady state chain of probabilities. And this is going to show me in the long term, what is the probability for the dyad to stay in the long term if the transition probability that we observed was relatively stable, is going to relatively consistent. So if my study just stop at taking a look at my sample, then my job is done. The data analysis part is done. But what I'm also interested in doing is I'm going to run some cross-group comparison. And this is the part where I plotted out the probability of each subgroup so that I can tell just by eyeballing the results whether there is any differences, any variations. If so, if there are any variations, I need to perform some follow-up test. So this step is very similar to the moderation analysis, where you notice that the relationship between two variables may be moderated by a third variable. So now you are going to plot out under different, maybe one standard deviation above or below, and also at 0, you are going to plot everything out. So for my follow-up test, I did the chi-square test of the independence, which is going to help me know if I notice there are any differences across the subgroups, whether those differences are statistically significant. So this will help me answer my first research question. These are probabilities for the 34 dyads that in my sample, 26% of the time, they're either in state 2 or 3, and about 32% of the time, they're working on the state 4 relational management. But in generally, they're working more on safeguarding the client's welfare compared to the fifth and the 6th, which is more about the professional development of the supervisee. And now I'm going to answer my second research question, whether the pattern that I noticed based on my sample is going to be similar in my subgroups. So I plotted the steady state probabilities later. So let's take a look at the 3 grouping variable. I group my sample 3 times, and each time based on one supervisory style. So for the abstractive, interpersonally sensitive, and task-oriented, I all use the cutoff score 7 and 6. You may notice that the number in the subgroup for each time is not evenly distributed, but that is okay at this point, because what we are comparing is not frequency. What we are comparing is the steady state probability. So then that is okay. But I am trying my best to distribute the number of each subgroup as close as possible. These are the plots for the subgroup comparison across 3 different styles respectively. And to me, the first thing that I would like to say is the pattern that I generated based on my sample cut across all the subgroups. So they mainly focus on 2, 3, and 4. It looks like it's very consistent. What is different then is within each subgroup, there are some differences. Some of them, the difference is very small, but some of the differences look much bigger than others. So after performing the chi-square analysis, what I noticed is that the interpersonally sensitive subscale is the only discriminating scale that generates the differences across the subgroup. The differences are statistically significant. For supervisee who rated their supervisor very high on interpersonally sensitive subscale, they tend to work less on the last stage, furthering professional development. This makes sense because for highly interpersonally sensitive supervisor, they tend to address the relationship-related issues. They may focus more on the relationship between supervisor and supervisee, the relationship, the therapeutic alliance between the supervisee and their client, maybe the parallel process between the counseling and supervision processes. And the next finding is a little bit tricky to explain because the difference is significant in the medium level. One thing that I managed to explain this is for this group comparison, there are only 8 in the high group, about 14 or 16 in medium and low respectively. So compared to the dyads in the low group, the medium is a little bit higher. So they are less likely to work on the foundational competencies. And this can be observed from the state 3, 4, and 5, that they are more likely to work on state 3, 4, and 5, even though the differences for 3, 4, and 5 is not statistically significant, but it shows a trend that is consistent with the literature. According to the G-power for the contingency tables, when the power is 8, in order to achieve a effect size, a small effect size, the data points needed would be 1,625. In order to achieve effect size of medium, the data points needed is 181. And in order to get a large effect, the data points needed would be 65. And people may ask me the question, it looks like you only have 34 supervisory dyads. So how could you meet any of the standards in terms of the effect size? But actually, what I was dealing with is way more beyond than 34 dyads. Because what I am analyzing is based on the frequency matrix, the table, which actually gave me 575 transitions that serve as the base for my data analysis instead of the 34 dyads. So the study was designed to be sensitive to a result between a small and medium effect, about 0.2, and the observed effect size based on 575 data points is 0.19, which is statistically significant, and it is within the targeted range of effects. Some implications for Markov chain analysis. I personally feel that there are really a lot of great methodologies that may be very widely used outside our counseling profession. Some interdisciplinary collaboration is really encouraged because we may be able to learn some methodology from other fields, which may help us ask some research question, encourage us to think different ways to answer the research question that we may have. And Markov chain analysis is a new means to study the process features. We are studying a sequence of the events, the transition of these events, and which is different than a lot of research, which is about what are results from the process or how people perceive the process through interviews or some inventories. Clinical supervisor, they may think about how to conceptualize each supervision session by using a very customized code book, and they may reflect on the supervision that they have done in the past. What are some states they tend to stay in the long term? What are some states that they tend to stay in the state that they want to change depending on the professional developmental level of the supervisees. They may also use these analysis to inform their monitoring supervision states and the transition between them in the here and now. They can have some self-talk, reminding themselves those are some states based on the developmental level of my supervisee. I would like to shift my focus more on certain states like relational management or case conceptualization, as opposed to foundational competencies. And counselor educators may manage to use these methods to inform their teaching. They may record or study their teaching and learning dynamics in classroom, and Dr. Liu may be interested later in finding some ways to analyze her data. For future research, I would say people can use different frames of reference to conceptualize the process. I adapted Boarding's supervisory goals to use it as a codebook for my study. But if there is already a pre-existing codebook that you can borrow directly, that's going to be great. If there is any codebook that you may adapt and then use, that's great too. But if you cannot find any codebook that you think may be best for your study, you may need to develop a codebook for your study. And this analysis can be used to study not only supervision process features, it can be used to study counseling or education process features, such as K through 12 education, the supervision of teachers in training, not only the counselors in training, and the dynamics in counsel education classrooms. It can also be used to examine how transitional dynamics may interface with other factors. For my study, I focus on how the transitional dynamics differ based on the supervisory styles, but you may examine what are some other demographic variables that may be interfacing with the participants' transitional dynamics, whether there are any cultural influences. You may have a sample with domestic counseling students versus international students. You may also group the sample based on the cultural affiliation of the participants. And another thing that I think which can be very meaningful is to build a national database for longitudinal track of the changes. For my personal experience, the training experience in the past, I think we, as doctoral student advisor, we were asked to record our supervision session for the supervision of supervision, but it may not be required for all the counselor education training programs. So if all those data can be recorded and collected, this is going to form a very large database to track the longitudinal changes of supervision practice. I did another study by using Dr. Granello's 2003 data set, where I noticed that for her sample, if I take a look at the entire sample, compare that to mine, there is some similarity. But if I specifically divide the sample based on the trainees' training experience, so that the trainees' experience is very similar to mine, the dynamics detected are very, very similar to the percent of 90% similarity. So this can show that longitudinally, the dynamics didn't change that much, but this is worth further investigation. And in my study, there is, I would say, it's one limitation where I focus on the transition between the states. I didn't incorporate the time dimension. There may be the cases we have two groups of data. We coded the data in a very similar way, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4. But for each of the state, the two groups of the participants may stay in the state in very different length of time. Some group may spend a lot of time on state 2, whereas another group stay maybe very long time in the state 4, but this may not be easily told if I don't incorporate the time dimension. But in future studies, I will consider code my data either through based on maybe every 5 minutes, I'm going to code the data, even though they may stay in the same state, or I will code the data based on every 10 lines, every 5 lines, or every 10 sentences. So this is something I will consider doing in my future study. Here I list some selected references. If you are interested in knowing more about this analysis, feel free to reach out to them. Also, let me know if there is any place that I can be of help. So this is what I prepared for today. Oh, it looks like it's exactly 1 hour, perfect timing. So now I would like to invite each and every one of you and share any thoughts that you may have, comments or questions that you have.
It's very, very interesting. Thank you so much for teaching us about what your work has been.
Thank you so much for the platform. It's very helpful because I feel I really would like to introduce this analysis so more people will know how to perform this analysis, and this may be used, applied to their own research agenda. Also, if any of you are interested in working on projects by using Markov chain analysis, let me know, or sequential analysis. I'm advocating for both of them. One is very micro level. This one is relatively macro level, about detecting what is behind the very micro level transition, the eventual pattern as a result of the small level transition. So,
I have a question to think about is the potential moderators, as you were talking about. Because supervision training, not everybody receives supervision training the same. So just like not every supervisors would do similar training or similar way of doing supervision. So it could be also due to training, exposure, experience, also theoretical orientation, right? So I'm wondering how that might actually be moderators in explaining the differences in how long people will stay. Like I could see, I'm looking at Gideon, whose background is psychodynamic, and they tend to remain focus a lot on the psychodynamic relational aspect between the supervisor and supervisee, as well as the supervisee and the clients, right? They tend to focus, if my perception is correct, they tend to be less task-oriented, but more relational, dynamic-oriented. Mm-hmm. So if your sample is like, so if the sample is not representative across the board, mm-hmm. or should we study focusing on this school of thoughts, supervisors who come from psychodynamic perspective, how do they run supervision? Mm-hmm. People who are CBT, how do they run supervision? People who have no supervision experience, they just know, I just tell my supervisee what to do kind of supervision.
Mm-hmm. Dr. N, you know what? You just actually bring up a great research study, right? For Gideon, if he has a sample of supervisor, supervisee who practice in terms of psychodynamic-based supervision, what about just have a group of supervisor, supervisee who practice in that lanes and see how the dynamics look like? Then if your university also have another cohort who are more CBT driven, what about study the transitional dynamics of that group? And then you can see the two big group as two subgroup and run some cross-group analysis and see whether there is any difference, whether our assumption is right, whether there are any differences. We can run the analysis. We can also pull them together so that we get a big picture. When we put them together, for my sample, I didn't differentiate my participants based on their theoretical orientations. I noticed that they indicate very wide range of theoretical orientations there, but definitely that can be a step that I can move forward in the past so that I can divide my sample based on their theoretical orientation to see whether dynamics, transition dynamics vary. And another thing that I'm thinking about, since the psychodynamic supervision and CBT-based supervision are very different. One is very relational piece oriented. The other is very problem of a solution focus, which is very structural. So I'm thinking maybe a different code book may be developed so that one code book can be used to study the psychodynamic supervision, whereas another study where you use a different code book to study the CBT-based supervision. So I think Great and brought up a great idea for doing a research study.
I have a question, Dr. Lee. First of all, thank you very much. It's very fascinating. I find it interesting as well. And thank you for your time and expertise. Somehow I lost you in, I understand the states according to Borden's model. Somehow I lost the analysis of the transition between states. That is, when you showed the graphs, And the frequency, as I understood it, the percentage, actually, maybe you said it wasn't temporal. So I guess I misunderstood those graphs where you showed the percentage of time in each of those states. And I thought that was a measure of a state. And so somehow I lost the analysis of transitions and the probability of transitioning from one state to the next. And maybe that wasn't your concern. So I'm sort of showing my ignorance about this method.
John, I think you brought up another great question. So I would like to share my screen with you again so that we may focus more specifically about the point where I didn't explain myself clearly. Okay, I'm going to share my screen right now. I think this is the slide. So first, because I mentioned the operational codebook that I used, so all the data, the verbal exchanges between supervisor and supervisee, first, they were turned into a series of numbers. For instance, that 3 sentence, I put 4, and the next 5 sentence, I put 2. So it's going to be a series of numbers. And if it's 1, 2, 3, then I'm going to code the data and put that into the frequency table. The transition is going to be 1 to 2. So it's going to be the cell F12 from state 1 to state 2. I'm going to mark 1 down. And then it's going to be 2 to 3. I'm going to mark the cell 2, 3, F2, 3. I'm going to mark that. So the number is going to be all put into the frequency matrix first. Then I calculated the probability based on the frequency. For each column, I divided the frequency of each cell of the total over the total frequency for the same column. So then I had the probability for each cell. So the frequency matrix was turned into a probability matrix. Then we're going to move on to the right side of the screen where you see the big chunk of the matrix with 50 as the power. So this is the probability matrix that I had. I transformed from the frequency matrix. Then if I raise the matrix to the 50th power, it's going to give me still another matrix. It's just a different numbers I'm going to get. But if I apply the rule of multiplication of matrix, then I multiply the matrix with a vector, which is like one column with 1 on the top, all zeros below, then it's going to give me one line of probability. This will show me what is the percentage of the dyads they're going to tend to stay in the long term. Are they more likely to stay in the state of 4? Are they more likely to stay in the state of 2 or 3? So it's a matter of the multiplication rule for matrix. And for the equation, I think maybe some professional from mathematics or statistic background can explain why we're using this equation. So I hope that helps. But if there is anything confusing, please let me know.
Yeah, I've done some matrix multiplication, but it's been a long time. But basically what this does is it allows a two-dimensional matrix to become a single point. And so when you go to the next slide, that's what allows you, I think, yes.
Yes.
Now it's become one-dimensional, but the important thing is for me to understand the 2 dimensions behind that one-dimensional point. Is it not?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So at first there are 2 dimensions. Before I multiply the matrix with a vector, one line. If I don't have that, yes. If I raise the power of the matrix to 100 times, iterate 100 times, 1000 times, it doesn't change. It's going to be a matrix. But once I multiply the matrix with one vector, it's going to give me a vector, not a matrix. So then the line of the probability is plotted onto this chart where you can see the probability they're likely to stay in the long term. So this is a prediction of the probabilities.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question, but I'm going to let someone else take a turn.
I'll jump in here. I think, Dr. Lee, this is awesome. I think it fills for me a gap in which so oftentimes in supervision research, we're just looking at like a rating scale or something, but this really digs into like, this is how we could begin to quantify process. So that feels really exciting. I think there's also an advocacy issue here that you raised, which is how do we get good process data, like good high quality process data, and that could look like a national database of supervision research. So I'm committed to efforts to really make that happen, whatever that may look like. But I want to highlight, I think, this piece here for myself that I'm learning, where there's interesting work to then be done around at what different developmental of the supervisee do you use different states or different focus, let alone what are those differences across, say, clinical counseling or school counseling? Like, do those show up within training programs? So I suppose this is much more of an appreciation and really highlighting, like, this really fills a neat gap for me in my own understanding. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon, for your encouragement and support for my furthering my research agenda. And yes, I agree with you that the developmental professional level of the supervisee, I personally feel just intuitively is going to affect how the transitional dynamics may vary. And for my sample of the data, as I mentioned, the majority of them are master's level students. So I tend to still see them at a stage where they're still early on, even though there was one doctoral student supervisee, but the student is still in their first year of training, and there is one postmaster's practitioner. This is also their first year of working. So I tend to broadly see them as homogeneity in there, whereas I may have a very divergent sample with some supervisee who have been in the field for 5 or 10 years, and I would assume the variation is going to be more salient. And this actually was showing by another study based on the 2003 data set, where I compare the sample by dividing the sample into 2 based on the trainees' counseling experience, where one group has significantly longer experience than the other, then the dynamics is different. So I really appreciate that you bring this point out. And also, since given your background training more in the psychodynamic orientation, and I think that can be a great way to focus specifically on a specific theoretical orientation and how the dynamics may be similar to what I found here in general, or you have a different distinctive way of analyzing your data. Thank you, Gideon.
So I'll go. Well, thank you, Dr. Lee. This is really, really interesting. Really appreciate you going through this in detail with us. Well, I was thinking actually one thing when I was hearing your results, I'm also psychodynamic as my basic training, and then pretty interpersonal in my supervision style. So when you presented the results saying that some interpersonal supervisors may not focus enough on the professional development, I'll say, okay, this is something that I need to pay attention to. So, but sounds like there are so many interesting ways to compare different groups. Dr. Ng, you compared different supervision styles. Dr. Ng suggested the different theoretical styles. I was also thinking about some multicultural styles. And then Gideon suggested different supervisee developmental stages. Those are all, yeah, so I just want you to comment on that.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for being here today and also share your thoughts. And yes, I would say first, when you say there is not too much work that have been done for furthering professional development, yes, as we can see from the results page here, we know that there are two primary functions of clinical supervision. One is to safeguard our clients' welfare, and the other is to further the professional development of the supervisee to help them grow into independent practitioners. So I definitely can see that the focus is primarily about safeguarding clients' welfare here, but the other piece of the professional development can be always kept in the mind of the supervisor, so that can be highlighted whenever appropriate and also needed. And I think Shiyun also brought up a great point where the multicultural lens can be instilled as maybe as a grouping variable. If there is any issue that you think can be very crystallized into specific states, and you may consider developing a code book or using some code book based on some multicultural or social justice based framework to code the data and see how the dynamic may be similar to or different than each other. Thank you.
To follow up with that, I think about multicultural, I wonder if we could do it like to make it like a, I don't know if there's an experimental and non-experimental design. They say to train like say 20 supervisor with to increase their multicultural supervision competencies, right? And then randomly assign a group of supervisors that have not gone through specific or more targeted multicultural supervision training, and then analyze their work with the supervisees and see if there's a difference as a result of multicultural supervision training in the way they address the issues between the supervisor and supervisees. So I wonder, can you speak to whether we could use this as a like to as a way to look at outcome variables as a result of an intervention?
Yes, Dr. N, I think this is another great idea for doing research. Yes, I think then if you are randomize your sample where one, you have control group where supervisor don't have multicultural, don't provide that training, whereas the other group, you provide multicultural training. And then the question to me, the most important thing is, what is your focus? Maybe you will not use the framework that I developed here. Maybe it's going to be specific about the multicultural training module that you use. What is the highlight over there? Maybe start from there, develop a very customized code book. So apply the training for one group and then another, but you can still use Markov chain analysis to perform in the long term for the group who receive multicultural training, whether the transitional dynamics look similar to or different than the other group. So I think that can be empirically, it can provide support and saying, okay, these are the outcome. And we are analyzing the data by seeing what is actually happening. We're not collecting the data based on how they rated a scale, based on I interview you share what do you think of the training itself as beneficial or not very helpful. So I think by using the data, this is something we collected during the here and now. I think it's just complement by providing additional perspective in supporting any argument you want to provide to the readers.
Thank you.
Any ideas about how you may be able to apply this analysis in your future studies?
I'm not sure if you're familiar with motivational interviewing.
I learned some knowledge about motivational interviewing, but I'm not practicing by using motivational interviewing.
Because I did some in graduate school, and now I'm working with an addictions population. And Dr. Miller, who I think is a pretty thorough researcher, and so he sort of designed this process, and it's used, it's heavily used in the addictions field. And Dr. Miller has, as I said, he's scrutinized his theory over the years with continued research. And one of the things they do is some pretty meticulous coding of interaction between counselor and client. And I've never heard of this method used, but it seemed, the idea is we're trying to address ambivalence in the person who has a substance use issue, and we're trying to increase motivation for change. And so the interactions between client and counselor, they're meticulously coded, and the counselor is encouraged to land in these, I think they would be called states in your case, to spend this much percentage of the time in this particular state as a predictor of increasing client motivation to change. So this seems like a perfect, you gave some real world examples of how this method is used in the business world, for instance, but it seems like a counseling framework and theoretical orientation, although he doesn't call it that, that would be perfect for this.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing your knowledge and experience in motivational interviewing. So if there is a very well-established framework that can be used to conceptualize the counseling process, it's going to be great. We can say, okay, by analyzing the actual interaction between the counselor who use motivational interviewing and their client, okay, to what extent in the long term, what is going to be the percentage of the time they're going to specifically work on some states, and then do a correlational study correlated with the outcome of the client's change. So I think that you bring up a great point where I can see the interface of Markov chain analysis and the traditionally used statistical method, how they too may be interfacing with one another. That can be very helpful and very interesting.
I think, let me just add, at Oregon State, Dr. Kastainen and a group of his students, actually, they are very much into corpus linguistics. They're looking at words that the people use and to analyze patterns and things like that, which I don't know much about it, but CRLL had done a session on that. I think the corpus linguistic and this way of analyzing states transition, you're not just only focusing on words, but you're also looking at transition, and things like that. Particularly if you add time into it, is how long people stay in one state, or what does that mean, to stay in one state? Is it because they're stuck in that state, or is it because they are so professionally oriented to stay in one state, because that orientation prizes that state of being, compared to, there are so many reasons why people are not able to transition. And I think it's a very good way to fuse the two together, or integrate them together, not just looking at the language or words people use, phrases people use in the way they interact, but also which particular domain they tend to remain in, and things like that. And then of course, then you can use quantitative and qualitative, can become a very good integrative mixed method way of looking at a particular interaction of phenomena from a more holistic perspective.
Thank you so much, Dr. N, for bringing that up. And one of the reasons that I think I'm more interested in analyzing the process itself about the verbal exchanges is because I had the training background in linguistics in the past. So I'm not familiar with the corpus linguistics analyzing method, but I think my previous training make me focus on the communication of people through verbal language. So I think it's a great idea if there any mixed methods research can be done by bridging the two. That's going to be great. And I also noticed that Dr. Liu planned to share something.
Actually, I had a question, and John and I had some, we're sort of interacting here. So I guess with the initial stage that you presented, you talked about assigning different numbers of state to to the qualitative data that you coded. So given that I feel like it's really qualitative at that particular stage, that you're basically like a coding and sort of like a judging where the supervisee is, or, you know, so, so I brought up the issue of the trustworthiness. I wonder, so like, for example, the example that you provided in the slides, some of us assigned it number 2, some of us assigned number 4, some of us assigned number 6 even. So I wonder like how would you deal with that in the research process? Would you involve like triangulation, you know, using qualitative term before you move on to the quantitative analysis? Like how, I guess I'm interested to hear how that might confound your analysis or even findings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for bringing that up. Since I'm not working directly with the numbers that I collected through inventories, I quantify the qualitative data. This is the piece where the qualitative piece get into this. And I think you bring up very valuable point. The triangulation of the coding is very important. For this study, I worked with an external coder who coded part of the transcripts that I had, and the iterator reliability was reported, but I personally noticed that this is definitely one area for future growth, particularly if more than one coder can be involved and they can compare and process, maybe make changes, adjusting the code book so that it can be better used to capture the actual interaction between supervisor and supervisee. But I agree with you that since it involves the piece where the qualitative part get in, so I think triangulation should be highlighted in my future studies. It's going to be emphasized. Thank you. And I think, Gideon, let me know, we only have about 2 minutes left. So now I'm going to handle this to Gideon, and let's see how he's going to manage that.
Let's see.
And just transition the state transition from 4 to 5.
Yes, yes, another state transition today.
That's it. We went from 1 to 2, now 2 to 1. Yeah. Dr. Lee, thank you. This has been an awesome, I think I'll speak for myself and maybe on behalf of the group, just a great learning opportunity and just collaboration and putting our brains together here. So thank you for putting this together.